I start the episode by introducing him, the author of the book Living to 120. Ladies and gentlemen, Adriano Panzironi is with us.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening.
So, Adriano Panzironi, are you ready to reveal to us, to tell us another one of the hidden truths you talk about in the book?
Oh yes. This evening we are going to talk about probiotics, those foods that we find in supermarkets we are told are good for our gut. Well, this evening we will discover their dark side.
Now, let's go straight to the topic of the episode, dysbiosis. I would say let's watch this introductory video, and then we will start, of course, to talk about this topic that is so important for us. Let's see it together.
Thousands of billions of bacteria reside in our intestines, giving a total weight of more than 1.5 pounds. This bacterial community is called the microbiota, with over 2,000 species of bacteria and hundreds of different types of fungi. When this bacterial population is in balance, it is called neobiosis, while if it is altered, either in quality or quantity, it is called in dysbiosis. Practically, this alteration is present in every person and is induced by different causes. In fact, the delicate balance of the bacterial flora can be altered by the use of medications, daily stress, but above all by the diet we decide to follow. It is precisely food that is the main factor of alteration, since what we eat acts directly in selecting different bacterial families, promoting or inhibiting the growth of different bacterial strains.
Mr. Panzironi, actually we don't think about it, but in our intestines there is a real world of bacteria.
Oh yes. In fact, if we were asked the question what part of our body is most exposed to bacteria, we would come up with the skin, because it is precisely in contact with the outside. Actually, we inside our body have this intestine that if we wanted to enlarge, it would reach an area of 400 square meters. Think even the size of 2 tennis courts. Well, every inch of these 400 square meters is filled with billions of bacteria.
In fact, the amazing thing is that we cooperate with our bacteria that practically affect our metabolism.
And yes, in some ways it's like we breed these bacteria and we get things out of them, including even the essential elements for our gut cells that feed on them. We develop obviously vitamins, but they do so many other things that science hasn't been able to understand yet.
So we pretty much keep our bacteria within the established boundaries and exploit their functions, obviously, for our own well-being, as if we were animal breeders.
Yes, only these bacteria of ours are so many species, about 2,000, so we are talking about a real ecosystem. Well, when we eat, we are able to alter this relationship, this balance, by inducing an increase of one part, let's say, of the bacterial families, let's say, against another one instead, that is significantly reduced.
So we, when we eat, decide which colony to grow or which colony to starve.
And yes, in fact, the reason why eating incorrectly induces a phenomenon of alteration of this balance, of this precisely ecosystem, and this can induce metabolic diseases, the alteration of our digestive system, and also that of the immune system.
Mr. Panzironi, we talk about eubiosis when we are in balance and dysbiosis when this balance is not there. So we asked our Dr. Maria Immacolata Costanzo to talk to us precisely about the phase of dysbiosis. Let's see it together.
When we have an alteration of the so-called microbiota, so we are in a framework of dysbiosis, this can induce a number of important symptoms of diseases that are precisely directly related to this bacterial alteration. Those suffering from dysbiosis may experience problems related to digestion, and these problems are accompanied very often, always, by bloating, abdominal pain, meteorism, flatulence. Very often they are also patients who have candidiasis. Frequently there are phenomena such as diarrhea, such as constipation, the alternation of diarrhea and constipation, but also problems related, however, to forms of dermatitis, allergies. In short, in dysbiosis, there is a picture of general malaise that induces the patient to a weakness, to an extreme ease of getting sick frequently. Dysbiosis can also be a trigger for other more serious diseases, for example, irritable bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative rectal colitis, and even autoimmune diseases.
Mr. Panzironi, we heard from the doctor who told us about the symptoms of dysbiosis.
Yes, actually, when we are in dysbiosis, we have an alteration of this ecosystem that then induces systemic pathologies of the whole organism. But it is also able, as I told you, to alter the digestive system and the immune system. That is the one that has to keep under control precisely these bacteria that start to multiply.
Here, however, actually what happens to our gut microbiota?
We have the lower intestine, the one that, let's say, the large intestine that is about 3 feet long, where we have stool formation. And we have there a greater presence of bacteria. Well, when these bacteria migrate to the upper part, which is the small intestine, we have the phenomenon of dysbiosis.
So then there's the large intestine, which is the last part where the stool is then really formed.
Yes, in fact, the problem is that we have this intestine separated by the ileocecal valve, which is just to keep these two intestines separated. Well, we in the upper part of the intestine, the one precisely the small intestine, we have, let's say, the metabolization of our foods and assimilation. So when we have an invasion of the bacteria present in the colon, this induces the important problem of dysbiosis.
However, these undigested foods practically become food for the bacteria, which then begin to multiply uncontrollably.
Of course, for this reason, nature has provided 70% of our immune system precisely to defend this passage that joins the large intestine from the small intestine.
Mr. Panzironi, this evening you will have to talk to us, obviously, about what are the causes of dysbiosis, and especially the various intestinal diseases that can affect us. To facilitate, obviously, our viewers, we have made a video where the digestive system is explained. Let's see it together.
Our intestine is 7,5 meters long and is divided into the small intestine, about 6 meters long, and the large intestine, about 1,5 meters long. Digestion begins in the stomach, where hydrochloric acid and pepsin break down proteins and partly fats. Then the food bolus is poured into the small intestine, where it is metabolized by pancreatic amylases, which break down protein by peptides, fatty acids, and complex carbohydrates. Along the small intestine, enterocyte cells, which have precisely the intestinal villi, absorb the broken down nutrients, and finally the food ends up in the large intestine for final breakdown by bacteria and excreted as feces from the anus. The bacterial presence is very high in the large intestine, but as one goes up into the small intestine, the bacterial load is significantly reduced.
Mr. Panzironi, we saw in the video that food, after it leaves the stomach, undergoes the action of pancreatic amylase.
Oh yes, this is perhaps the most important stage of digestion, because through these pancreatic juices we are able to break down protein biopeptides into individual amino acids and complex sugars into simple sugars, and then allow the intestinal villi to, shall we say, assimilate these nutrients.
So basically, this is the trickiest part of the digestive part, let's say, because if this food was used for other reasons, obviously it would reduce the bacteria to multiply.
Of course, in these 6 meters of intestines, we need time both to digest and to assimilate these nutrients. It is evident that an excessive presence of bacteria in this very part of the intestine induces fermentation of sugars and putrefaction of proteins, thereby inducing the formation of biogenic amines and nitrosamines, which are pro-carcinogenic elements.
But what is the cause of this abnormal formation of bacteria that should not be there?
It is essentially what we eat, because when we eat, we have to ask ourselves one thing besides ourselves: who will feast on this food? And if we ask ourselves this question, we will also understand how important the food we decide to use and eat is.
We found a video by Dr. Gasbarini that talks about proper nutrition to avoid the occurrence of dysbiosis. Let's watch it together and then comment on it, shall we? Okay.
And here we move to the adult's discourse, because it is clear that if an adult has a microbiota that somehow developed the first years of life, it is not that he can do much with it. What can he do? He can try to modulate it all the time. This means, however, that somehow the adult cannot do a well-made diet for a month, because after that month the microbiota will tend to return to its original one, so the diet has to be done all the time. In that way, it cannot modulate, at least transiently. Remembering, however, that if it deviates, it can go back to what it was before. So the basic concepts are those with which microbiota and Homo sapiens grew up together, because that's what the good microbiota was based on. So a diet very rich in fiber, and then the concept fruits and vegetables is the basis of our diet. Grains are fine, but you also should not overdo it. Now it's seen that you have to actually reduce them slightly in quantity and especially favor the whole grain type. Avoid the ones that are too refined. Animal proteins somehow limit them in their intake.
So, Mr. Panzironi, we saw that Professor Gasparini told us how nutrition can change our microbiota.
And yes, Dr. Gasparini is one of the best Italian experts on the microbiota, and he said an important concept that when we eat, we alter our bacterial flora, which is one reason why I say that when you choose to do a proper diet, you cannot just do it for a period as if it were a diet, but you have to do it your whole life.
In fact, you also told us that if we induce dysbiosis through diet, then it will be very difficult to return to a phase of balance. So use biosis.
Yes, the problem is that we have most of our immune system practically close to the colon, and so it is obvious that if we have a phenomenon of dysbiosis in the upper part, our immune system will have more difficulty regulating these bacteria precisely because they are located away from Peyer's plaques, which would be the area where we have most of our immune defense.
Look, though, Mr. Panzironi, the professor also said that the diet should be, here I read it, plant-based with fiber, whole grains, and little meat.
When I tell you that unfortunately science has great specialized professionals, but then they lose the overview, is the case even of Dr. Gasparini, because he is a very good gastroenterologist, but then he gets lost because he does not know what has been the evolution of man. Well, man appeared on our planet 2.5 million years ago, and for 2.5 million years he ate meat, fish, vegetables, and little fruit, so his bacterial flora was formed with this kind of diet, certainly not eating grains.
However, Mr. Panzironi, the professor was talking about Homo sapiens, which is obviously more recent.
Well, but man sapiens, first of all, comes from Homo erectus, but in any case, he appeared 200,000 years ago, while grains have been used by man sapiens only in the last millennia. So it is clear that the formation of the bacterial flora comes precisely from what I told you before.
So we can infer that dysbiosis comes from modern nutrition. What are these types of foods then?
Look, unfortunately, it is precisely the foods that are the basis of the Mediterranean diet. That diet that we are told is also protective against diseases of the gut, in fact, is the real cause. We are talking about pasta, bread, pizza, rice, legumes, corn.
However, Mr. Panzironi, are you telling us that what we until now have considered protective for our intestines is practically against it?
It's not just against, it's really the cause of it, but the main reason is that these foods have up to 80% sugars, and well, when these sugars enter our intestines, we advance some of the bacterial flora families that are harmful to our intestines.
So in this regard, to corroborate obviously his idea, he created, together with our editorial staff, a video in which he explains how sugar creates dysbiosis. We see it together, and obviously then we comment on it. Let's see it.
Carbohydrates are the food that more than others are able to alter our gut microbiota, but also damage our digestive system. First, sugar interacts with the gastric juices, preventing the proper digestion of proteins and fats. Then in the duodenum, sugars are attacked by bacteria, inducing acidification of the food bolus, which will induce ineffectiveness of the amylase enzymes necessary for protein digestion. Finally, acidification of the food bolus induces disruption of the protective mucus present on the endothelium of the intestine. In addition, excess sugar selects a homofermentative bacterial population, which will result in the elimination of the heterofermentative population necessary for the digestion of soluble fiber, the metabolites of which are precisely propionic acid, acetic acid, and butyric acid, substances necessary for the nutrition of enterocyte cells in the intestine.
Mr. Panzironi, the video clearly explained to us that sugar is able to alter the digestion of the foods we introduce.
Yes, this happens right from the stomach because precisely the excessive presence of sugars prevents the proper production of hydrochloric acid and pepsin, which are needed and essential to break down proteins into individual bipeptides. Then the moment this food bolus is poured into our intestines, they act against, let's say, the action of pancreatic amylases, which are essential precisely to break down bipeptides into amino acids and complex carbohydrates into simple ones, and thus allow their assimilation by intestinal bile.
And this will also allow the proliferation of proteolytic bacteria that make proteins putrescent.
Of course, because if we have not cleaved these proteins, we have not assimilated them, it is obvious that they remain available to these bacteria that can make them putrescent and then create the formation of the biogenic amines, such as cadaverine, such as histamine, such as spermidine. But especially histamine is very well known because it induces the alteration of our immune system. And this, of course, allergic people know very well.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, Professor Gasparini also advised us to use whole grains because they contain more fiber, so then I also infer legumes.
Well, I have to tell you that instead it is totally the opposite. Precisely these foods that are considered healthy because they are whole grains are the main reason for the appearance of dysbiosis.
You are basically twisting the dogma of medicine, so I kindly ask you to explain what you are saying right now.
The argument is very simple. It is obvious that a whole food has a huge presence of fiber, and this binds the proteins and carbohydrates in the food. So our intestines will have more difficulty to break down, to detach these proteins from the fibers and these sugars. So this food bolus that is not yet broken down will go down the 6 meters of the intestine and reach all the way to the colon, practically littering our intestines with foods that can be attacked by the bacterial flora, either fermentative or putrefactive, and thus induce the production of dysbiosis.
Look, the video also talked about homofermentative and heterofermentative bacteria, those that are found within, obviously, what is considered the good bacterial flora, the famous one of Bifidus and Lactobacillus.
Look, science has always divided the good bacteria from the bad ones. The good ones are the bifidus, and instead the bad ones are the proteolytic ones, the ones that then make the proteins putrescent. Actually, this is an outdated description because 99% of the intestinal dysbioses that are found are fermentative and are caused by those very bacteria that are considered good.
So you are making us see things from a different point of view. Would you like to explain this concept better?
Then, let's say that when the food bolus is rich in sugars, these sugars are attacked by these fermentative bacteria that induce an increase in the acidity of this food bolus. This means that the families of bacteria that can survive this food bolus are homofermentative type, and this induces instead the death of the heterofermentative families that can work and live only at more neutral pH. And these, unfortunately, families that are destroyed and that are altered are those that produce the substances that are needed by our intestines, which are propionic acid, butyric acid, acetic acid.
Look, however, let us understand a little bit. Is that why when some people eat foods such as fruit, they feel their intestines swell?
Certainly, because if these fibers were demolished, broken down by heterofermentative bacteria, they would produce these 3 metabolites that I told you before. If instead they are attacked by homofermentative bacteria, these will lead to fermentation and lactic acid production.
So look, Mr. Passions, when we have realized that obviously the situation is corrupted, so we are in the dysbiosis phase, we have to run to foods that contain probiotics, or rather, excuse me, yes, so-called probiotics, that is foods that have good bacteria inside, which should restore the balance, obviously, in our intestines. In this regard, let's see this service, and then I would like us to comment on it together. Let's see it.
In the beginning, probiotics were sold exclusively in pharmacies as supplements prescribed by doctors after antibiotic treatment. Later, the food industry realized the potential of this new supplement segment and made over-the-counter fermented milk products and started one of the most fulminating successes in the food world. With multi-million-dollar budgets and miraculous promises, we have seen an increase in the supply of probiotic foods in the refrigerators of our supermarkets, a revolution that in just a few years has seen the turnovers of the manufacturing companies grow to double digits. Danone, one of the players in the market with its two products Activia and Actimel, reached sales of 23 billion euros worldwide in at least sales that are still growing almost 10% every year.
So the video was very explicit. Basically, the probiotics market in the last few years has practically exploded with huge turnovers. Mr. Panzironi, we notice obviously even from the advertisements we see on television.
And yes, let's say that these probiotics have become the golden goose for the multinational companies that have colonized our very supermarkets.
Look, I know you a little bit. It seems to me that you don't really agree with the marketing of these products, or do you?
As I always tell you, I am never against the spirit of enterprise. It is obvious that a multinational company has to sell the things it knows how to do, and it does it in the interests of the company and the shareholders it represents. I have it instead with those authorities that should control public health and should prevent the marketing of these products.
Look, Panzironi, in your calmness, I see you very fierce this evening. You want us to understand a little bit why we find these products practically in the homes of all Italians.
The problem is not only of the Italians, but it is European. In fact, these rules are now dictated by Europe, and we have a Europe that cares about the size of the zucchini that is sold and does not care instead about what happens if we introduce live bacteria within a microbiota that must still have its own balance.
Look, but then these products that obviously assure us that they help against constipation or strengthen our immune system don't work?
The problem is not that they don't work, otherwise there would only be a problem of fraud in commerce. The thing that worries me is that they work because, unfortunately, we don't know in the long run what happens to our delicate balance of the microbiota when we introduce these bacteria-rich foods.
So I am a little bit intimidated, so I would kindly ask you if you can explain this last concept well.
We many times have talked about the balance of the immune system, which is divided into two major classes, Th1 and Th2. The Th1 is precisely concerned with destroying viruses and cancer cells, while the Th2 is concerned with bacteria. And well, one of the best-selling probiotic products are those that are rich in a bacterium called the LK4 Shirata. And well, this bacterium induces a protective increase against colds. That's why we are told it is immunostimulatory, in your opinion. Which of the two classes raises Th1 or Th2?
Well, and after interviewing her really many times, I think I'm quite prepared. So I tell you, if we're talking about flu, about Th1, because that's what kills viruses.
Perfect. I'm glad you learned something from our interviews. And well, what happens if we give these products to a person who has an autoimmune disease problem where precisely the immune system is already unbalanced towards Th1?
That this could practically make the autoimmune disease worse.
Sure, it's very simple, but not only that, but if we, for example, take Mrs. Maria, who goes to the supermarket, she eats 10 cans of this product because maybe she has lunch with it, and we know that our intestinal balance is made up of about 2,000 bacterial strains, and well, introducing such a large amount of bacteria of one type, how can it alter this balance precisely of the bacterial ecosystem?
Well, in this case, I really don't know what to tell you, really.
The problem is that even the science doesn't know. Dr. Gasparini, who is one of the top experts, doesn't know, let's say, microbiota, because we are in the beginning, are the first scientific evidences. So let's think if a housewife who goes to a supermarket and tries to solve the problem of constipation by eating these products can do it.
Look, I can tell you that you are not the only one who has these doubts, because Dr. Gasparini himself made a video that we found, and he talks about this very thing. Let's see it together.
There is a lot of flourishing of probiotics, prebiotics. People also take them sometimes a little bit thoughtlessly. Let's take stock a little bit because it's important.
A sensitive point even for this market that is worth several hundred million euros. The big problem is that if it is clear that taken for granted that the microbiota is of enormous importance, we should first of all characterize it, understand what is in it, and understand what that person needs. And we to date are not able to do that because characterizing the microbiota as a whole is difficult and also expensive. The big problem is that we have very few probiotics. We have thousands of species of bacteria, mostly thousands of species of bacteria, and very few probiotics, because in reality there are very few probiotics on the market. But let's say that in the future we will see new, very potent probiotics. We will see probiotics that can fight obesity. We will see probiotics that can fight inflammatory diseases in an important way. They are all study, but we have to see if they will then really go to the market and if they are treated that way. Then if one has to analyze what we have now, there is a little bit of everything. There is good stuff with good scientific evidence. There are things that are practically devoid of any evidence that somehow clearly should be discouraged, precisely because there is no rational. And also I have to tell you that in some cases the production does not guarantee a stability. That is, after a while it goes on the market, there is nothing left in it. And in other cases, even worse, what is written on the label does not coincide with beat A. So we maybe think there is beat A, there is beat B, with obviously risks for the consumer.
So, Mr. Panzironi, we have seen that even Professor Gasbarini tells us that we don't actually know what bacteria we need to restore the balance of the microbiota.
And do you think that we leave this choice precisely to the housewife who goes to the supermarket to get these products when we absolutely do not know how this will then induce an alteration of our microbiota? Do you think there is a French researcher who found that this is something published in 2009 in Nature, and well, he verified that a pharmaceutical company, a multinational company that was selling these products was putting bacteria inside that induced obesity in children.
So you are saying that basically we, by modifying the bacteria in the microbiota, are able to prevent or cause metabolic diseases?
This is the new frontier of science. And then you also heard Gasbarini, who was saying these things, and well, this French study even demonstrated and discovered precisely this correlation with obesity, because French breeders were even using the same bacterial strain to induce obesity in pigs.
Well, this is really impressive, I have to tell you.
Knows that I never believe in synthetic research, but this should make us think that evidently we are not yet able to evaluate, then to do a mapping first of all of our microbiota, and then decide if not to take a particular bacterial strain. Other thing, if instead these are administered by a doctor after he has done a proper mapping.
So we've seen that probiotics basically have their own problems, but with food we are able to rebalance our microbiota. Just with the editor, she created this video on foods, obviously, that help us. Let's see it together.
Foods that are capable of modifying the gut microbiota, bringing it back to a state of eubiosis, are undoubtedly those that contain so-called prebiotics. These elements are identified by the names pectins, gums, mucilages, soluble hemicelluloses and fructans, which are divided into fos and sos. These soluble fibers are mainly found in vegetables and fruits, but also in milk and its derivatives. They are considered prebiotics in that we do not assimilate them with our intestines, but they are digested by the bacteria present that will convert them into acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid, the exclusive food of our intestinal cells, the enterocytes. Of particular importance is inulin, a phosph that passes unaltered through the stomach and directly feeds our bacterial flora. Inulin is found in foods such as Jerusalem artichokes, chicory, asparagus, onions, leeks, garlic, and bananas.
So Panzironi, basically to rebalance our microbiota, we have to eat those foods rich in soluble fiber.
Yes, actually we have to do two things. On the one hand, to kill those bacterial populations that are not conducive to the gut, and on the other hand, to kill the growth of those that we want to colonize precisely our gut. The problem is that every square inch of our digestive system is already colonized, so we need to challenge the part of the bacteria that we want to eliminate with food. We manage to do that because by feeding basically only, let's call it that, to the good ones. So the heterofermentatives, inevitably the homofermentatives will tend. But did you explain?
You explained to us, however, that there are fermentative bacteria that are still able to eat fiber. Then, therefore, even eliminating insulin carbohydrates, as you call them, will not lead to the elimination of this species.
This is the problem with dysbiosis, that we need several months, if not years, to restore it. Because, as I was telling you then, these bacteria, once they have colonized a part of the intestine, do not leave it very easily. So it is obvious that in that case we have to act in other ways to try precisely to eliminate those bacteria, also by eliminating them altogether.
Look, Panzironi, some doctors just prescribe antibiotics just to obviously eliminate the presence of bacteria in the intestines. What do you think?
Which is unfortunately a dangerous choice, because we could lead to the formation of bacteria that become resistant to antibiotics. But not only could we benefit Candida, and we could benefit viruses that are much more dangerous than bacteria.
Look, Panzironi, do we have any advice, obviously, for those who are watching us right now or who will see us later, obviously, to solve these dysbiosis problems?
As I always tell you, nature is absolutely perfect, and nature gives us extraordinary tools, which are spices. Well, if we eat a certain constant amount of spices, so from morning to evening in the 3 main meals, we are able in several weeks or months to restore the right balance and thus reduce the phenomenon of dysbiosis.
Would you like to help us, maybe by giving us some spice names?
Yes, they are spices that are extremely antioxidant, antibacterial, antifungal. We are talking about turmeric, cinnamon, ginger, oregano.
Good dysbiosis that can also be the prelude to other much more obviously difficult diseases. So let's delve into one, exactly that of irritable bowel disease. So let's look at this video on irritable bowel syndrome.
Irritable bowel disease, or also called IBS, or irritable bowel disease, affects 15 to 20% of the population. Although it is not a clearly identifiable disease, it is capable of significantly worsening the quality of life of people who have to resort to anti-diarrheal or laxative-type medications. In fact, a flourishing pharmacological and herbal activity has sprung up behind this disease, involving the use of more than 230 substances. The action of these active ingredients is directed against the problems of flatulence, aerophagia, meteorism, which are digestive action or have antispastic effects, with a total turnover of more than 150 million euros a year. Then there are laxative drugs, which are divided into those with osmotic action, contact and laxative fibers, with a turnover exceeding 240 million euros per year.
So, Panzironi, we understood that IBS involves about 15% of the Italian population. We are talking about 10 million Italians.
Yes, I would say a real army, but in short, I think that instead, even the situation is worse than what has been described, because those who do not have problems with recurrent constipation or diarrhea, and well, when we have these phenomena, it means that anyway, we are in the presence of the phenomenon of irritable bowel.
However, we can find practically a lot of products in pharmacies to relieve this discomfort.
Yes, actually, medicine in this has really given the worst of it. It gives us so many molecules to be able to control diarrhea, or precisely laxatives to be able to regularize intestinal transit. These, on the other hand, in my opinion, are very dangerous things, because they risk chronicizing the disease by not making people who suffer from it ask the right question: what are the foods that induce it?
Exactly, I fully agree with what you just said, because obviously antidiarrheal medications or laxatives take away the symptom but not the problem.
Sure, because when we have irritable bowel, it means that we have an inflammation precisely of the digestive system, which also then induces the alteration of peristalsis. So we have to avoid eating those foods. So this is a kind of alarm bell that tells us that those foods should not introduce them. Instead, people prefer to keep eating what they eat every day and then take the pill to solve the problem that day, and then tomorrow they will take another pill and so on until then. This problem becomes much more chronic and can lead to more serious diseases as well.
So, Mr. Panzironi, we have a video from Dr. Maria Immaculata Costanzo who tells us just about IBS. Let's see it.
IBS was identified in the past very generically as colitis.
Identificata nel passato in maniera molto generica come colite.
It is a disease that is not serious, however, it tends frankly to become chronic. So it then tends to be precursor, so to speak, to other even more serious diseases. It can trigger autoimmune diseases. However, it can precede Crohn's disease, ulcerative rectal colitis,
La malattia di Crohn, la rettocolite ulcerosa.
irritable bowel disease causes alterations, peristaltic muscle contractions that can go slow and cause a phenomenon of constipation, or it can go to accelerate, then induce a diarrheal phenomenon. Phenomenon that of diarrhea that sometimes occurs violently after ingesting foods that our intestines do not digest properly, but can also be generated by stressful factors.
Dei cibi che il nostro intestino non digerisce correttamente, ma può essere anche ingenerato da fattori stressanti.
It also causes a sense of bloating, affecting the abdomen, which may feel sore and tense.
Che può presentarsi dolente e teso.
In irritable bowel disease, one can also witness the presence of mucus in the stool and the uncomfortable sensation of not having emptied the colon completely of stool, so-called tenesmus.
Dalle feci, cosiddetto tenesmo.
Panzironi, Dr. Costanzo explained very well the symptoms of irritable bowel disease, which are really very bothersome, and I can confirm them because until some time ago I also suffered from it.
Yes, indeed, it is a condition, although not serious, but it is likely to significantly alter the quality of life of the person suffering from it.
Again, the causes are the foods of the Mediterranean diet: bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes.
Of course, because irritable bowel is essentially an untreated dysbiosis. So when we eat these sugar-rich foods, we induce the alteration, then the multiplication of these bacteria that lead to inflammation of the intestinal walls, therefore also altering the nerves that regulate intestinal peristalsis.
It's these nerve endings that we have obviously in the colon and in the intestinal part that make us maybe even more sensitive to any kind of pain or what's going on in our intestines.
Yes, this is true, because we have to remember that the gut is also called the second brain, because there are so many neurons that precisely with their endings try to manage a little bit all that are the functions of the intestine, including precisely also the movement, which then allows us to evacuate.
Mr. Panzironi, how can these diseases be made to reduce, however, effectively?
Well, as we said, we have to eliminate those foods that induce dysbiosis. So again, bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, legumes, corn. And then we can use spices, as we said before, so turmeric, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. Because in addition to being antibacterial, they are also strongly anti-inflammatory. So they act on the mucosa of the intestine by reducing inflammation and restoring it for intestinal peristalsis. But I think, something about that, by the way.
That's right, Mr. Panzironi, but I would say let's go back to the topic of the evening of the episode, and let's go back to the other bowel diseases, the so-called MICE or chronic bowel diseases, where within we find Crohn's disease and ulcerative rectocolitis. We have prepared a video presentation.
In Italy, inflammatory bowel diseases, called IBDs, affect about 200,000 people in the age group of 15 to 40 years. The most important diseases attributable in myces are Crohn's disease and ulcerative rectocolitis. Ulcerative rectocolitis was already known in 1859, while Crohn's disease is named after its discoverer, Burrell Bernard Crohn, who in 1932 described inflammation in the ileum in some patients. Myce disease was still unknown in the 1950s, but recent years have seen increases in new sufferers of up to 20-fold, a progression that now seems to be accelerating dramatically. The etiology of inflammatory bowel disease is still unknown, but science agrees that there is a pathogen whose presence in the gut triggers the onset of the diseases.
Mr. Panzironi, these two pathologies are really very difficult.
Yes, they are very dangerous diseases for our intestines, and then they appear in young people from 15 to 40 years old, so they have a long time, many years, many decades to become chronic and then become very dangerous pathologies for our life.
There, you said very dangerous, but I know that you can also die from these pathologies.
Oh yes, because if we have the occurrence of toxic megacolon, this can even induce septicemia, rupture, perforation of the colon, and induce 4 to 40% even death of those affected by this event.
Look, in the video, it was said that there has been a 20-fold increase in patients in recent years.
Oh yes, this makes us realize that the worsening of our diet just matches the worsening precisely as the occurrence of this disease. That's why I tell you that nutrition is everything for our health, but especially for our digestive system.
So in the meantime, let's see what Dr. Maria Immacolata Costanzo tells us about these two diseases, so we can maybe understand them a little bit better. Let's see the video.
Inflammatory bowel diseases such as Crohn's disease, such as ulcerative rectocolitis, although they seem to have the same trigger effect and treatment pathway, actually affect our intestines differently. In fact, Crohn's disease can affect a part of the gastrointestinal tract virtually from the mouth to the anus, while ulcerative rectocolitis selectively affects only the rectum.
Colpisce in maniera selettiva esclusivamente il retto.
Now, these are autoimmune inflammatory diseases
autoimmunitarie
induced by the excessive activity of the immune system called Th1, which is deputed to destroy viruses, fungi, and even cancer cells. In Crohn's disease, inflammation arises that virtually induces thickening of the intestinal wall, which creates edema, ulcers, which can also come to be abscesses, fistulas, perforations, give bleeding. Ulcerative rectocolitis, on the other hand, can induce a general worsening of the condition, thus the appearance of anemia, perforation, and toxic colon. Frankly and significantly increase the risk of colon cancer.
So Panzironi, two diseases that are quite distinct but have a common cause, basically the disruption of our immune system.
Certainly, because we have 70% of our immune system right there in the gut, it is clear that an overactivation of it also induces damage to the tissues closest precisely to our immune system.
Here, however, let us understand a little bit about the relationship between the hyperactivation of the immune system and obviously such dramatic pathologies.
When we make a cut on a finger, we notice precisely that this finger swells and starts to hurt. And if we don't keep it clean, it also starts to form pus. And well, we have the same effect also practically in our intestines, where there are these real ulcers that start to get infected and can't find a solution.
Well, let's say that internal lesions with all those bacteria will definitely be very difficult to treat. However, what is it that causes these lesions?
Directly to our immune system, because we, in a phase, let's say, of chronic inflammation, we have a production of metalloproteases that go right to break down our matrix. which then should be rebuilt once the inflammatory event is over. The problem is that in chronic diseases like this, we have an excessive production of metalloproteases and we never have a repair. To this, we then add the action of the bacteria and viruses inside our intestines, and it is clear that this will then lead to a very heavy chronicity that can lead even to even more serious diseases.
So, Mr. Panzironi, medicine has long understood that there is definitely a pathogen that induces the activation, of course, of the immune system that then creates these kinds of pathologies. You, on the other hand, seem to have different ideas, but also very clear ideas, and that is why you have created, together with our editorial staff, a video that I would like to show, obviously, to everybody. Let's watch it together.
Science has long been trying to find the trigger of the immune system's overactivity, termed Th1. The inflammatory cascade is initiated by certain cells of the immune system, such as dendritic cells, which in turn activate macrophages. Both of these produce inflammatory cytokines named interleukin I, interferon gamma, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, which attract other immune system cells, including neutrophils, which release proteolytic enzymes that damage tissue. This damage to the intestinal endothelium is increased by the continued presence of intestinal bacteria in a war that turns chronic, preventing tissue from healing and thus ulcerating. The trigger of the disease is precisely diet, which by inducing alteration of the fungal microbiota causes the excessive Th1 immune response.
So, Mr. Panzironi, you identify Candida as responsible for these pathologies.
Always, of course, I make it clear that it is not me who says this, but it is researchers who have published in a very well-known and authoritative journal that precisely is gut. And in this publication, you refer precisely to studies done on people, sufferers of precisely Crohn's disease and ulcerative rectocolitis, and noticed an excessive presence of Candida and have looked into this and have noticed that there is really a real collaboration between Candida and another bacterium, Escherichia coli, that creates a kind of biofilm. And well, this leads to the activation precisely of the THI system and then the formation of those metalloproteases that I was telling you about earlier that then destroy our endothelial tissue, then inducing the formation precisely of ulcerative rectocolitis or Crohn's disease.
So then it's not difficult to deduce that practically also for these diseases the relationship is very close, obviously, with the diet that we make and then with the occurrence, the progression, obviously, of the disease.
Certainly, again, the foods responsible for this disease are those rich in sugar, as we said, pasta, bread, rice, legumes, potatoes, corn. The reason is very simple, because Candida is a fungus, and the fungus uses as its only energy substrate precisely sugars. So we, by eating these foods, we eat all these sugars that enter our intestines and promote the growth precisely of Candida, which will then induce this, let's say, so bad collaboration with Escherichia coli, which will then induce the activation of Th1, as we have seen of the pathology of Crohn's disease and ulcerative rectocolitis.
So once again, the foods of the Mediterranean diet,
certainly, once again, I am responsible after all. How can you not think that there is a correlation between what we eat and the onset of intestinal pathology?
So we understood that the ones that are bad for our microbiota are the foods of the Mediterranean diet. However, there will be foods that are good instead.
Of course, it's all those foods that have always been the basis of our diet when we were Homo erectus, when we first appeared on this planet, until we discovered agriculture. We talk, of course, about meat, we talk about fish, we talk about vegetables and little fruit, because at that time there was not a thing available of fruit. We say that basically the proteins, when we ingest them, if we don't have a problem with the presence of dysbiosis, we are able to get down them very simply and assimilate them so they don't induce any alteration of our microbiota. As far as soluble fibers, we talked about that precisely, lead to the formation of the heterofermentative population, and then to transform these fibers into three fundamental metabolites for our intestinal system that are precisely the villi of the cells that have to assimilate that form, the endothelium precisely of our intestine, and they are the three metabolites, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid.
I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart Adriano Panzironi, the author of the bestseller Living to 120, The Truth That No One Wants to Tell You, who has always been here beside us to answer and help us understand all these sometimes very complex and tragic concepts for many of us.